I got to correct the bio. I was never on the Council of Economic Advisors. I was
I apologize.
I was on the staff, senior international, senior domestic. What's this guy? What was his name? Summers.
You could have been
Larry Summers. Whatever happened to him? Anyway,
you could have been on the council.
Not in that administration. I couldn't. Okay. I just want to briefly say just two things and then go into the whole risk thing. These are not exactly risk issues. I want to second what both Jared and Lou said about education being obviously important, but much overrated as the pivot on which everything turns. It's a pet peeve of mine right now in this discussion. Whenever you start to talk about unequally shared growth, start to talk about wage differentials, inequality, why are most people lagging, people keep on reaching for the highly educated people are doing really well and the rest are not, and that's just not right. I mean, it's true that on average people with a college degree are doing better than people without, and people with an advanced degree are doing even a little bit better, but it's not as if having a college degree is anything like a guarantee of doing well. Even the median college graduate is experiencing income gains this past generation that are way below what everybody was experiencing in the previous generation. It's we're talking about 1% a year or less in real terms in the incomes of college grads over the past 25 or 30 years. So this is education. This is just not the story, and it's part of a broader picture. And the picture that a lot of people want to have when they talk about income inequality is that the college-educated top 20% are really doing well, and it's the bottom 80% that are doing badly. It's not the top 20%. It's the top 5, top 1, top 0.1, top 0.01% that are doing really well. I'm going on too long about this, but it's always worth remembering the share of income going to the 9th decile, people between the 80th and the 90th, has been declining. All of the redistribution is to the top percent. Most of that is to the top 1% within the top 10%. So it's not, and all of that is saying that whatever the notion that more education or more training for those who've lost their jobs is going to be a large part of the solution to the things that are worrying us is just completely off base. The other thing I want to say before getting to the whole risk stuff is I believe that Jared is right that there's a lot we can do about the market distribution of income. That the laws of supply and demand are a lot less rigid than we like to think, and I'm spending a lot of time working towards the next book, looking back at what Claudia Golden calls the great compression of incomes that took place under the New Deal, and it's certainly that experience seems to suggest that you can actually do quite a lot to diminish market inequality, but we're not quite sure how, but we do need to think of that. It can't be all aftermarket action. So let me talk about the risk issue. I think the point, and I'm going to be more just put on my economist hat and say, well, what is it we think we could be doing and we aren't doing? The point in all of this is that we have a society now in which obviously people face a lot of risk. That's not necessarily a bad thing. We expect risk is part of life, but where we see people facing a lot of gratuitous risk. Where the individual or the family is facing a lot of risk, where from the point of view of society as a whole, there actually isn't all that much uncertainty or risk. So that to take the example, there is the risk of having high medical bills. That's a huge risk for many people, even people who have health insurance in many cases, and yet the aggregate medical expenses are not highly uncertain. We know that there will be a certain number of people who have expensive illnesses. You don't know if it's going to be you, but in some sense there shouldn't be any social risk involved in those expenses, and yet there are large individual risks. Where there are these things where there is really not a whole lot of risk from the point of view of society, but they are actually big risks from the point of view of the individual, we should ask ourselves, is it necessary? Do we need to have this extra bit of harshness, uncertainty in people's lives. Now, the counter is always, well, it may not be possible to greatly reduce those individual risks without severe effects on incentives, without somehow undermining a market economy. But that's not something to take for granted. That's something to ask. Is it really necessary? And I'm going to be doing actually less of a response and more of a, but I think it will bear on the previous commenters. But let me give you a little bit of what I think about this. Let me identify three big areas where there are huge individual risks, not a whole lot of aggregate risk, and where the question is, well, does this have to happen? The first is healthcare. The financial risk. Obviously, the risk of getting sick can't do very much about, but the financial risks, which then turns into also in some cases your ability to actually afford treatment. Huge individual risk, virtually none from the point of view of society. Can we do something about that? Second is retirement. Your ability to pay for your retirement years. Again, to a slightly lesser extent, there's some uncertainty about just how big will GDP be in 30 years, but the society's ability to pay for retirement is not highly uncertain. The individual's increasingly is. And the last is layoffs, unemployment. And actually, there although industries do go down and the structure of the economy changes, obviously the amount of individual uncertainty is vastly greater than there is in aggregate. And this is some of what Lou was talking about. What do we know about our ability to do something about these? In the case of healthcare, there's a reason why this is always coming up now as the first issue, because there we know the idea that, well, it's important to we have to allow people to experience some of this risk to give them the right incentives, and trying to insulate people from all of the financial risks of ill health would be undermining incentives. That's 150% wrong. That is, everything we know says that our system, in which individuals are left with many of these risks, or are left to fend for themselves, or insurance companies are left to try and sort people out by risk, is not only exposes people to a great deal of uncertainty, but is actually a far more expensive system to run. I write about this every few columns, but just basically we've developed a system in which people devote. Companies and others devote a large amount of resources to determining who really needs health insurance, so as not to give it to them. This is a large risk to which U.S. citizens are exposed, to which citizens of other advanced countries are not, and we get worse health care at higher expense as a result. So that's a clear case where we are, it's complete. We have completely unnecessary risk, and the administration's proposals, which are essentially to shift the balance of this risk to individuals and put more risk on people and privatize and is absolutely perverse. It's based on a theory of how this particular piece of the economy works that is completely at odds with all of the evidence. On retirement, I think there's something similar to be said there, and part of the infuriating thing about the Social Security privatization was that there was never any explanation of why we should be increasing the riskiness of people's retirement. And in fact, even the arguments that were made on behalf of privatization always turned out to be actually arguments on behalf of investing the trust fund in the stock market. They were never arguments about why individuals should have investments in stocks. And this was a completely gratuitous attempt at increasing risk. The shift from defined benefits to 401ks and on allowing companies to underfund their defined benefits also appears to be, as far as I can make out, gratuitous risk shifting. What on earth would lead us to believe that an individual investing his or her own assets is going to be able to do better than some kind of collective investment of resources for retirement? So this is a clear-cut case where we have moved in the wrong direction at the private level, and to kind of shockingly have failed to move in the wrong direction at the public level. That was a very weird experience last year to actually win one. The most interesting intellectually and the most difficult, I think, is the kind of thing that Lou was talking about. Layoffs, loss of jobs, unemployment are devastating for the individual, for the family. We know that they're terrifically hard. There are things you can do, but I think the incentive issues are more problematic here. You can have more generous unemployment insurance for the income effects. You can have better coverage. There is at least some reason to think that can have some adverse effects on unemployment. I'm not dead convinced of that, but there at least it's no longer something like healthcare where you can say that everyone does it better than we do. The U.S. does have a pretty, in some respects, a pretty good employment picture, and it might be in part because of the replacement rates and the duration of benefits. You can talk about some kind of rules of the game about layoffs. And that's a really interesting issue. Of course, we had the riots in France over an attempt to basically move their system a small direction in an American direction. Were the rioters wrong? You got basically no hint in U.S. news coverage that there might possibly be a case on the other side. But I would actually say that it's not at all clear. It is true that if you make it hard for firms to hire, if you make it hard for firms to fire people, they will be less willing to hire people. But they will also be less likely to fire people. And it's not exactly entirely a sure thing that we know which way that goes in terms of the overall effect on workers. There is at least a possible case for, at the very least, I think there's a pretty strong case for suasion. I think this is what Lou was saying, that there ought to be some public role in trying to limit layoffs without actually forbidding them. There might be room for something more. That's much more difficult. I think it's much harder to make the argument on that. But we shouldn't take it for granted that freedom to fire is always the best thing for everybody. That it works out well in the long run. I think what I would say is that we definitely have a situation where we know that our society is becoming riskier, that the income fluctuations of individuals are larger, where the chances of a plunge into poverty or bankruptcy are increasing. We also know that at least some of the major elements of this are unnecessary, that we actually could do better at zero or negative cost in limiting them. This is, I guess the point is that this is all really important. This largely gratuitous increase in risk individual risk that we've seen, that's a fairly substantial subtraction from our welfare. Just plain straight economics. I'd like to see some numbers on it, which I haven't seen somebody calculate, but I think we could probably argue that this all by itself, is subtracting a number of years of economic growth all by itself from the situation of the typical American family. Probably has some slogan. It's like something like "Together we can do better" or something like that. But anyway, yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Paul.